This was my wife. That's her with my dad. As you can see, she was a fairly dark woman. She wasn't black, but that doesn't matter to me. I loved her, and I didn't care about her skin color. Skin color to me isn't something that's important. I'd like to talk to you about something very important, though. Discrimination, especially racism. If you want to experience racism, you have to go where you are clearly a minority, be it because of religion, culture, clothes, skin color, or something else. I was taught about racism in school, and I sympathized with non-Caucasians of all colors because the injustices were, and still are, very real. I also recognize that the lashback from the oppressed creates its own whirlpool of problems. But despite being called whitey, honky, peckerwood, and whatnot when I lived in the U.S., and even once being told by a group of blacks to go home, honky, when I was in my home neighborhood, I didn't ever experience much else in the way of discrimination based on color myself. I had friends of other races, and I always tried my best to be fair towards people. I was raised that way. Yet, despite all of this, it took moving to Indonesia to make me really understand discrimination based on race or color. I had already experienced other kinds of discrimination in the U.S. Because I wasn't macho enough, macho men would assume I was gay and harass me. Once I was driving on my scooter, which was purple with pink stripes because that was all that was available when I bought it, except for an even worse choice. And so these two guys with a girl in a pickup truck were harassing me and wanted to fight with me. I guess they thought I was gay, and that's something that deserved punishment. I don't know. I was also harassed because of religious differences and other things. In Indonesia, I came to experience both racist discrimination and white man's privilege. Something I'd never experienced, really, in an overt way. Which is the flip side of the coin, and at the same time. I paid high prices for food, higher than the locals. I paid higher prices for services and products, but I got jobs that I wouldn't have otherwise. I was considered a strong, smart, rich playboy, so my wife was often insulted. People who'd never seen a Caucasian before, and there were many, were either fearful or curious, and I could never blend in with the crowd and feel invisible because people were constantly looking at me. Do you know how it feels when everybody's looking at me? I mean, I wasn't a celebrity, but people were always looking at me. Literally, always. I'd hear workers shout out, "Hello, Mr." And then they'd laugh. I came to understand eventually they were just nervous. But I'd hear them say, "Hey, Bule," or "Hey, Londo." Now, Bule or Londo, that means white person, but it's not always polite. Or even, "Hey, Botak," or "Hey, Gundul," which means, "Hey, Baldi." Also not very polite. And that was just because of my skin color. Once on a public bus during Bush's reign of fear-mongering, two young Muslim men got on the bus and started doing a mock radio show in which they made fun of the U.S. The passengers were very uncomfortable. I knew the two men were doing it because I was there, but I didn't react because honestly they weren't entirely wrong. In the end, I told them how I felt about what they said, and they became friendly with me. Another time I was in a taxi and I complained about George Cowboy Bush. The taxi driver was a Christian, so he said, F you. Lots of people loved Obama there. Why? Well, because he'd lived there a couple of years and loved Indonesian fried rice. Somehow to them, that made him a good guy. I also ended up becoming something of a national celebrity when my wife was struggling with cancer and we were selling food on the street to make a living, primarily because I was white. And I wasn't the only struggling Caucasian married to a local who made the news. This despite probably millions of struggling Indonesians in the same circumstances. 14 years together, and despite having appeared on national TV several times from 2014 to 2016, this still happened. Not that everybody treated me that way. Some people treated me better because we were going through these struggles. Living where I was a minority, where I could never hide because I stuck out like a red shirt amongst black and white tuxedos, where I was prejudged because of the media, 350 years of domination by the Dutch, and the same race idiots who had come before me and the stereotypes that they had developed as a result can be a blessing and it can be a curse. And just like mixed marriages in the U.S. can be discriminated against, the same thing happened to us. My wife was called many nasty names, even to the point that a cop assumed she was a prostitute because I was riding behind her on our motorcycle. Because of her dark skin, she was often presumed to be a maid or a nanny, especially when alone with our kids. And if she was with another woman who fit the Indonesians' stereotypical image of a Caucasian's Indonesian wife, which is light-skinned, lots of makeup, jewelry, and fine clothes, that woman was assumed to be my wife whether or not I was there. And my wife was assumed to be the nanny or maid. Sometimes ignorant Javanese people would insult her as we were walking by. They'd speak in Javanese so I wouldn't understand, but they'd do it because we were together. I didn't understand the Javanese they used, and she wouldn't tell me until we were far away, because she knew I'd get angry. I don't even know how many times people called her a whore or prostitute because we were together. I would not recommend Indonesia as a place to visit or live for those of African descent. They treat the Papuans, who look a lot like Africans, poorly, and they tend to assume that any black is a Nigerian drug runner. Really? I understand discrimination of many different types because I've been on the receiving end. Maybe it's not the exact same thing that you, my viewer, has experienced, though. Beyond what I've just mentioned, I also endured cultural and religious discrimination on a routine basis while in Indonesia. I was always a minority in Indonesia. Hair, skin color, height, religion, culture, language, etc. Even though I did try to fit in as much as I felt comfortable doing. My wife probably would have lived longer if her family hadn't sunk into that sort of discrimination and worked to tear us apart during her decline. I saw the minority groups there also being discriminated against in one way or the other by whatever group was dominant in that particular area. Some of them had an overly bad attitude about it, while others took it in stride. It can be small things like prayers at public meetings being done based on one religion instead of silent prayers for all religions. Or it can be even really bad stuff like bombings and attacks and stuff. Nevertheless, I generally felt safer there than I ever did in the U.S. Most people cannot own a gun legally outside of the police and the military, and the level of violent crime is very low compared to the U.S. Take guns away, and a lot of people are willing to get into deadly physical altercations. A generous guy, Steve, who I know online, but I've yet to have had the pleasure of meeting, said this, and I think it is interesting because his perspective from the South is a bit different from mine from the North. He still lives in Indonesia. Living in America and growing up in the South being white, I never understood when others complained about being treated different or being stereotyped because of their race. I looked at a lot of them playing the race card to make excuses. Some do, but not all. Until I lived in Indonesia, I was never the minority. Now I understand everything they were saying. Maybe I don't get the same injustice as many of them did in history, and even in present day, but being treated differently or stereotyped because of your race is a very hurtful thing. Not only when you're treated bad, but you can also be treated good to the extreme because of your color in Indonesia. Also, you feel it just as much in that as when you're overcharged for something because you're white. My wife, who is Indonesian when with the kids or even with me, has been asked if she is the nanny or the maid woman, the cleaning woman. I love Indonesia. I think Indonesian people are the nicest people I have ever met. I mean that, but the stereotyping by race is terrible. I can't talk because I am from the USA, and we still haven't got this right over there. I think the good thing about it all is it has woken me up to a lot of the racial issues in my own countries. Now, I did edit that a little bit to make it a little bit clearer, because he's not that great at writing, but that's what he said, or wrote, I should say. Look, discrimination is not cool, it's not righteous, and it's not necessary. It is born of pettiness, rage, indifference, hatred, ignorance, intolerance, narrow-mindedness, small hearts, and the passing on of lies. It does nothing for us as a species, and does a great deal of damage that is unnecessary. We are divided again and again by our own weak minds and the words of a few haters and fearmongers, to the point that unification for preservation seems to me to be a pipe dream at best. My heart is broken by the continuing strife, segregation, discrimination, and violence that causes parents of other ethnicities to teach their kids things that mainstream Caucasians will probably never feel they have to teach their kids, like how to behave around cops. I have heard bizarre claims based in fear, the past, and in indoctrination that are not based on current realities, such as the extraction of melanin from skin of black prisoners, and so on. And these false claims help widen the divide between each group. Stop selling the pain of your past to the next generation because they take it on as their mantle even when it's not really happening to them, and they perpetuate it. The way you think is the reality you create. When I say all lives matter, I do not do so to diminish the struggle that Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and so many others picked up, but were unable to finish. Nor do I mean to denigrate any person of color. I do so because I do not feel comfortable prioritizing one group over another, and because I recognize that not only blacks are suffering. It is not because I am trying to minimize the reality of racism against blacks in the U.S. and abroad. People from many different kinds of groups are being marginalized, and it isn't just an issue of skin color. I cannot understand why the emergency professionals, firefighters, police, and EMTs are treated so poorly when they put their lives on the line for everyone. It is unacceptable to hear people from these careers tell me stories of verbal and physical assault on their persons because of the neighborhood they're in. Get your heads out of your buttholes, people. Assaulting and harassing these heroes should not happen. If there is a legitimate problem, go to the proper authorities and register a complaint. If they won't hear you, find someone who will. Keep going up the chain till you get to the top if you have to. Make changes. Don't destroy the willingness of emergency personnel to enter your neighborhood because you behave like 10-year-old thugs with guns. I am deeply concerned by the number of black people who view all whites as racist. Yes, everyone has biases, but that doesn't mean you can't change, and declaring your allies as enemies is like burning bridges you haven't even used. I get it, though. They were raised with fear from both external things like racists and internal things like fearful family members. These sources have an impact. They experienced what I didn't, and that made them blind to the full extent of the problem, but also to the full extent of the solutions and alternatives. But if all whites are racist, then what can be said of John Griffin, who dyed his skin black in 1959, walked around pretending to be a black man, then wrote Black Like Me, a book that earned him continuing enmity from racists and even a good, nasty beating from the KKK in 1975? What about the Freedom Riders who were Caucasian, who were beaten and jailed alongside the blacks? What about the Caucasians and peoples of other ethnicities who walked alongside Martin Luther King, John Lewis, and the Reverend Hosea Williams in Alabama? The white minister James Reeb from Massachusetts was murdered for his part in those protests and marches, as was civil rights activist Viola Liuzzo, a white lady from Michigan. You cannot say all whites are racist without proving yourself both a liar and a fool. Truth be told, discrimination is a human issue, not an American one, and it exists virtually everywhere that the culture hasn't entirely embraced love and unity. Again, almost every country fails that test. Discrimination isn't a mental illness, it's indoctrination. Most racists were born into racist families, were indoctrinated into a hate group through taught hatred, or had so many negative experiences at the hands of another group that they came to identify anyone who fit the profile as the enemy. Yes, humans tend to fear that which is different, but that is primarily an instinctual or paranoid response that is from a long time ago when foreigners, who often look different in clothes and hairstyle, if not physical appearance, were invaders who brought death, destruction, and enslavement. This instinct toward xenophobia can be driven away through the teaching of tolerance and diversity, looking for similarities instead of differences, and accepting that differences don't mean evil is present. It doesn't have to be this way. Heaven can be here on earth. We just have to make it that way. Make the change by opening your heart and mind and letting go of all the destructive feelings in your heart. Unite and learn what is similar about you and those who you discriminate against instead of focusing on something as shallow as skin color, facial features, or even things like ethnicity, nationality, culture, and religion. Unify the earth. Save the earth. Be divine. I hope you'll someday be allowed to forget your skin color and hair and just look at yourself as a human being, an earthling. I think that's something that all people should strive for. And while you're at it, stop paying so much attention to skin color because it really isn't important. It's skin deep. When I was in Indonesia teaching people, I'd tell them I didn't care what their skin color was, they were all purple to me. Please stop letting people rile you up with words you've decided are offensive. Do you really want to give them that power over you? I don't think you should. Get up and follow King and the other tireless leaders of the movement when I was a baby that moved our nation a giant step forward for blacks and other minorities, and then for women. Get up and make a difference. Make America great. Now. Thank you for listening.